Hi, I'm here today to give you one of the many book reviews that I am behind on giving you. Today, in fact, as you will already be able to tell, is a spoiler-free review of Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Can you not eat the carpet? So Salem's Lot was my first foray into a Stephen King novel, and I have to say that it disappointed me more than a little. I'm going to separate my review into the 5 categories that I normally use to rate my books, starting with the characters and relationships. So the character scope of Salem's Lot was quite large because practically everyone in the town of Salem's Lot was included as a character at some point in this book. And yet none of them were particularly interesting or enthralling. Not only that, but the only female main character in this book was the first one to die. I understand that this was one of Stephen King's first novels and that it was written in the 1970s, but I think that this is a plot trope that needs to be called out whenever it occurs in movies or books, because it is a very repetitive and disappointing and unrealistic trope to have in books, that the female character is somehow the first one to make a dumb decision and the first one to die. So that is why I gave the characters in this book a 2-star rating. The plotline in the book was considerably shorter and less involved than you would expect from a book of this length. For a book of this length, you would expect it to have more setbacks and plot changes and twists and turns happening along the way, and yet very little happened in terms of plot whatsoever. It was a fairly standard and straightforward suspense setup and then just sort of defeat of the villain. This made the book feel quite slow and lagging because that plotline was definitely not worth the length of the entire novel, which is why I gave the plotline of this story a 1-star rating. So the themes and motives in this book actually were kind of the reason why the plotline ended up being so lagging, which is that it felt like Stephen King was trying to write some kind of philosophical literary book and also be writing a horror suspense book at the same time, which means that there were very large sections of this book that were filled with sort of philosophical musings and detailed descriptions that didn't really need to be there and held back the progression of the plotline. So because of this, I gave the themes and motives a 2-star rating. In terms of actual enjoyment, I didn't actually mind this book too much. Although once the villain of the book was actually revealed, it did get quite bland and uneventful in terms of suspense from then on. While reading this book, it wasn't too hard to see why Stephen King became such a good suspense writer later in his career, because the scenes that he did write that were intended to be suspenseful were actually quite intriguing, which is why I gave this category a 3-star rating. The bonus category that I've chosen for this particular book is actually a spoiler for anyone who does want to read it, so I would suggest that you mute the video until you see this icon disappear. So the bonus category that I chose for this book was the presentation of vampires. And I chose this because it was pretty much the only part of the book that actually got an emotional reaction for me, other than just sort of general vague interest. So I find vampire myths to be fascinating, and it really disappointed me and made me uncomfortable to see how the myth of the vampire was presented in this book. To me, it felt almost like the religious version of cultural appropriation, because a lot of the complexity and the history behind why vampires behave the way they do and why they can be defeated the way that they are was completely removed and replaced by a kind of storyline of God versus evil. In particular, a battle between Catholicism and evil. Perhaps I'm overreacting a little bit, but to me it just was really disappointing and very Catholic-centric, which made me uncomfortable, which is why I gave this category a 2-star rating. So overall, Salem's Lot got a 2-star rating from me, which is the lowest rating of any book that I have read so far this year. I'm hoping and assuming that this is because Salem's Lot is one of Stephen King's earlier books, because I know that he is a prolific and much admired writer of the horror and suspense genre. But overall, if I was to recommend a Stephen King novel to anyone who hadn't read Stephen King before, this would definitely not be it. Let me know down in the comments if you have read this book and what your thoughts are on it, and if you want to know any of my more spoilery thoughts on Salem's Lot, then have a chat with me down in the comments as well, because I would love to chat with you. I will see you in some other video very shortly, I am sure, and until then, as always, stay classic.
Sit there and count your fingers.